Alaska Insight is supported in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers just like you. Thank you.
Alaska has some hard fiscal decisions ahead. Governor Mike Dunleavy has proposed a budget that pays out a full permanent fund dividend while leaving a $1.5 billion gap. The governor says he wants Alaskans to vote on new revenue ideas or even perhaps what else to cut. Would that be feasible? We'll ask tonight on Alaska Insight. Good evening. We're joined in studio tonight by Governor Mike Dunleavy. Governor, thanks for being here.
Great to be here, Lori.
So what are your thoughts on the current legislative session? Lawmakers are in Juneau. Are you frustrated? Are you happy? What's the communication been like? Give us the temperature of what's happening right now.
Well, you've got to guard against being frustrated. This is the process. 60 people trying to deliberate and find their way out of a fiscal issue that we have, and that's the big issue on the table. And so I'm always optimistic. I'm always hopeful. And, we're communicating with legislators. We've had meetings with them individually and in groups. We'll continue to do that. And we are hopeful that they'll have some ideas that they can throw out on the table in terms of the budget, the size of the budget, but also how to pay for the budget. Mm-hmm. And as you know, the past several years, probably going back to 5 years, the state has spent about $14 billion out of its savings accounts. We're getting close to getting down to zero. And so we're going to have to make some decisions. And again, I'm hopeful that the legislature this year will float some ideas that could help fix the problem.
Do you feel like the focus is too much on you as far as what to do in that regard? Earlier this week, you were on Talk of Alaska and expressed some frustration that lawmakers are not yet putting proposals forward to really delve into how to fix this kind of impasse over spending. What are your thoughts about what you are or are not seeing?
Well, last year we rolled out some pretty bold proposals in terms of the budget because of the $1.6 billion deficit and the fact that oil had dropped from $85 a barrel in October to $55 in December, shaving off about $2 billion of potential revenue. We felt we had to take some pretty direct measures quickly. As we know, that led to a long discussion, a protracted discussion throughout the spring and summer. We also, though, put on the table some constitutional amendments to involve the people of Alaska to help determine the future of Alaska. We govern, we legislate for the people of Alaska, not special interests, but for individual people of Alaska. And so when we rolled out constitutional amendments regarding spending limits and the people should have a right to have a say in what the permanent fund looks like going forward and whether they should be taxed or not, like states do, such as Colorado, we were hoping that those constitutional amendments would get the scrutiny and be moved through the process so that the people can get a chance to vote on them. This year we rolled out a flat budget because last year the budget reductions seemed to take all of the oxygen out of the room. It left nothing for greater discussions on the measures that I just mentioned. So the legislature, someone in the legislature has criticized our approach to the budget. That's fair. But now we're hoping that they have some ideas. And we haven't seen a lot of ideas yet, but there's still time in the legislative session, and we look forward to engaging the legislature and legislators on an individual basis to help get Alaska on a track to a sustainable budget.
One of the ideas that you've put forward, and there's two proposals right now, is for a lottery. Tell us about what you envision there and how much money do you realistically think that could raise for the state?
It's a small amount, especially initially, $8 to $10 million starting out, but it can grow. It can get up to, depending on how what that lottery looks like going forward, it can approach $100 million. And we have a lot of tourism in Alaska, and the tourism sector is growing. We also have a lot of Alaskans that, whether folks realize it or not, they engage in gaming now, in-state and out-of-state. So this is an opportunity to try and get folks to voluntarily help the Treasury And it's our hope that the money that we collect, again, would go to causes such as homelessness, domestic violence issues, education, some of the social issues that we're dealing with and we want to improve upon. So it's a small measure, there's no doubt. It's a start. But from the feedback we're getting, it's supported by the vast majority of Alaskans. So we're hoping that the measure goes through.
As you mentioned, there are other gaming opportunities in the state now, a long history of bingo and pull tabs. Do you have concerns that a lottery system may take money away from those existing gambling avenues that provide money for services in communities across the state?
I don't, because like I said, I think there's a lot of folks that buy lottery tickets in other states. There's a lot of folks that leave the state and go down to the lower 48 and gamble and buy lottery tickets. And so I don't think it's going to make an impact on the traditional gaming that we have here in the state of Alaska. I think it'll be an add to gaming through a lottery, and will give us some money for the Treasury.
Were you surprised, Governor, by the response to your budget cuts last year, or did you sort of expect this, the protests, angry town halls, now there's a recall underway? Were you surprised by this reaction?
Not really, and let me explain that. I was in the legislature. I saw what was happening to our budget, what was happening to our state. We were growing the budget, and we have grown the budget over decades. As oil increased in price, we would increase the budget. And when oil receded over the past several years, we haven't correspondingly reduced the budget to meet those revenues. So we've been using our savings to keep to fill the gap between our revenues and the size of this budget. It's going to come to an end. It's either going to come to an end on my watch or the next governor's watch, but it's got to come to an end where we have our revenues and our expenditures in line. I'm compelled by the Constitution to put forth on December 15th a balanced budget. I also embedded in the Constitution are tools for the legislature and the governor. For example, the governor has veto power if the budget or there are bills that come through that the governor does not believe are in the best interest of Alaskans. The budget deficit is so large that there has to be some reduction measures. But at the same time, we look forward to having conversations again with the legislature on their ideas, if they have revenue ideas, what they look like. But in terms of the pushback and folks being upset, we knew that people were not going to be happy with reduced spending in some of these areas. It's not something I wished on Alaska. It's not something I looked forward to. I care about Alaska as much as anyone. You don't run for governor, you don't run for the legislature to hurt Alaska or to hurt Alaskans. But we do have a budget deficit that has to be dealt with. There is no secret lockbox stashed away somewhere in Juneau with money that I'm just refusing to put into the system. We have a serious fiscal issue. I think we can get out of it by working together, but all of Alaska, each and every one of us are going to have to give a little to get a lot, is the way I look at it.
So how do you see the Senator Natasha von Imhoff said, we don't have a fiscal crisis, we have a priority crisis. Do you agree with that?
I think all budgets that are put together, they represent priorities and values. But again, if you're bringing in $1.5 to $1.6 billion less than you're spending, you have a structural deficit issue, is what you have. That was backfilled by savings, $14 to $15 billion of savings over 5 years. And as I say, Lori, let me put that in perspective. If we had balanced our budget years ago, like I had proposed when I was in the Senate, we would still have $14 billion that could be applied to our pension obligation debt, our bond debt. You could have used that $14 billion, for example, to create renewable energy in the state of Alaska that could have provided Alaska's energy at very low cost or free for eternity. That opportunity is gone because we didn't want to address the operating side of the budget. And so now we have about $1.6 billion left, $1.8 billion left in our constitutional budget reserve. And if we don't reduce the budget or we don't come up with some other revenue measure, we will be close to no savings other than what's in the earnings reserve of the permanent fund.
I know that you're in favor of adhering to the 1982 permanent fund dividend law, that formula. But do you think that and you would like Alaskans to vote on it. Do you yourself think it needs to be changed? Is it, if the lawmakers and the previous governor hadn't reduced permanent fund dividends, we would be in even deeper fiscal problems today, would we not?
I don't know about that. And let me clarify something. It's not that I have a desire for an adherence to the statute as formed in the early 80s. What I'm saying is that whatever the law is, we need to follow it.
You see it as the law that has to be
So if the people of Alaska decided that they want to reduce the dividend, I support that. If the people of Alaska wanted to support elimination of most of the dividend and putting it into various accounts, that's what the people of Alaska want. This is who we serve. And if the people want to do that, then you know that they're behind that aspect of the fiscal, the fiscal solution, I should say. So it's not that I'm saying that, by God, we must adhere to this at all costs. If we're going to change it. But you should have the people up front supporting that. And that's why we're saying whether it's a constitutional amendment or at the very least an advisory vote that occurred like the one in 1999, get a read on the people, because what I'm hearing is the people don't necessarily agree with reducing the dividend without their input.
Do you think it was a mistake to eliminate the state income tax altogether when that happened? Do you think that it would have been easier to bring that conversation forward if there was an understanding that it's still there in the background and maybe it's only $10 a year until it needed to increase?
I don't think there's anyone that believes that the income tax would only be $10 a year.
Well,
Larry.
but I mean, if the system would have been kept in place. Say.
Do I think it was a mistake that they eliminated? Not really. Not really. South Dakota eliminated their income tax in the mid-40s. There's a lot of states that don't have an income tax. So no, not necessarily. Remember, Alaska, the existence of Alaska as the 49th state only occurred and was agreed to by those in Washington because we consolidated our resources under the government to be able to pay for government services. When we were applying to be a state, there was concern that we had such a small population that was spread out over such a large area that a broad-based tax like an income tax would not work for Alaska. So we were compelled to collectivize all of our resources under the government and to develop those resources such as oil, gas, timber, gold to provide revenue. So even back then there was a belief that small population, large landmass would not be able to underwrite government through an income tax.
I want to back up to something you said about there are a lot of states that don't have state income taxes.
Yeah, Florida, New Hampshire.
But not a lot of states. There's a
Nevada,
small
Wyoming,
percent.
I could keep going. I mean, it depends on, I didn't say all the states, but I should have said a number of states.
Okay. Let's hear from an Anchorage resident responding to a question about what they think should happen
Sure.
to stabilize state
Sure.
spending. Let's
Sure.
hear from them.
It's critical that we balance expenditures and revenues. So it looks like we are going to have taxes. I attended many public meetings and there was a lot of support for that. Of course, nobody likes taxes, but we also like infrastructure. We like our roads. And frankly, I love the ferry system. I was on it last summer. It would be a tragedy to lose the ferry system. So I would ask the senators and the governor to have an open mind about keeping Alaska open for business. If we want to attract new investment, we have to have a pleasant place to live.
So, Governor, this is something that we've heard a lot of. We heard this from Senators Begich and Giesel, that we need to have robust infrastructure, public safety, education in order to truly be open for business. Do you agree that those things have to be in place? And if so,
Sure.
how do we get there? What should that
Sure,
look like?
and first of all, I want to thank the individual who asked the question. It's that type of dialogue that's going to get us a solution. I guess my question would be, sure, I'm ready and willing to look at what Senator Giesel and Senator Begich's revenue proposals are. And I'm waiting for those. I'm ready to look at them. And in the context, again, of I'm hoping that the legislature as a body is also willing to look at and move to the people of Alaska the ability to vote on a spending limit that hems us in, and the ability to vote on an amendment that ties the people in the legislature together when it comes to taxes. In other words, both of them have to agree on taxes, the people in the legislature. I've got those on the table. I'm looking forward to proposals by the legislature, individual legislators, as to how they want to close the gap, what fiscal measures they're looking at. We've put on the table measures to reduce spending. If they have and if they don't want to reduce spending, or if they don't want constitutional amendments or advisory votes going out to the people of Alaska, I'm very interested in what their proposals are to fix the fiscal issue. So that's what we're waiting for.
When you go back to Juneau, are you planning to have that very conversation with lawmakers?
Absolutely.
And do you feel like they're sort of fiddling while Rome is burning, or what's your sense of urgency about getting these proposals in front of you that you can look at them?
Well, the legislature knows what needs to be done. The people of Alaska know that we all know what needs to be done. We need to close this gap. Again, we're going to close this.
But how?
We're going to close this gap either through reductions or a combination of reductions and other types of revenue. But again, in my conversations with the people of Alaska, they would be more willing to have the revenue discussion once they have assurances through spending limits and savings rules that we are not going to spend all the money that we take in, grow government, and then go back to the people for more taxes. So I'm looking forward to what the legislature proposes. I hope they have an agenda that's other than stopping the governor from trying to fix the fiscal issue.
Your Office of Management and Budget released a 10-year plan that includes 5 different scenarios, including one that's called the balance scenario. Under this, the basis for permanent fund dividends would change from half of recent fund earnings to half of the annual draw. Would you consider making this change? Do you think that that would be the way to get better fiscal stability?
Again, I'm willing to consider any and everything to help fix this fiscal issue. The question really is, do we also have, as part of the constant discussion on revenue measures, are we willing to hem ourselves in on spending? If we're not willing to hem ourselves in on spending, then we just need to let the people of Alaska know that, so they're prepared for increasing taxes, taxes, taxes. Why do I say that? In the early part of the last century, the federal income tax was put into place. And if you read some of the commentary at that time, they said, this is all we need. This is all we need. Federal income tax will take care of our needs. We're now $23 trillion in debt because that was not all they needed or wanted. So the issue for Alaska and Alaskans is, do we want to control ourselves in terms of spending so that when we come into another windfall, which we're anticipating doing with additional North Slope oil in the next 5 to 7 years, do we want to save that money and pay off debts? Do we want to save that money and put that into capital projects? Or do we want to have no safeguards and just keep spending all the money we get? Because if we do that, then the people of Alaska have to be prepared to basically be ATM machines for government, that we will go to them for more and more taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, property taxes, payroll taxes. All I'm saying, Lori, is it's got to be a combination. But two sides of the coin have got, one side of the coin has to be fiscal restraint if you're going to look at the other side of the coin, which is revenue.
But what we're seeing now with municipalities is they're doing exactly that, going to the people for more and more revenue because of reductions in the budget. So how do you balance those things, the need for local revenue against the larger need of bringing in money for state government? Last year you proposed deep cuts. This year not. Why not? When you're talking about the need to reduce spending, why not propose more cuts this year?
Because when we proposed the cuts last year, there was a vigorous and loud discussion which should have occurred, and we did anticipate it would occur, and it should occur. But we also put on the table constitutional amendments to hem ourselves in. You build a foundation of a sustainable fiscal plan, and part of that foundation is the controls and restraints on spending. What happened last year is those issues, the controls and restraints on spending, were lost in the argument and discussion about the budget reductions. So we decided to change the conversation this year by coming in with a flat budget, so that wouldn't take all the oxygen out of the room. So there'd be the ability now to talk about the underlying basis, the fiscal restraints, but also allow the legislature to say, hey, we'd like to contemplate a sales tax. we'd like to contemplate an income tax. So we've laid out our half of the coin on the table for Alaskans and the legislature. We're just waiting for the legislature to lay out their part of the coin, their part of the solution, which is what revenues do you want to look at, and are you willing to entertain these constraints and restraints on spending?
You've have said that the state must change the formulas that drive spending increases. The biggest of those is the formula for public education. What do you think the goal should be for that formula?
So what I really said, Lori, just to be clear, and I'm not saying there was a misrepresentation. What I'm saying is, if you want to reduce the spend that's going to occur every year, because we have formula-driven programs in education, for example, in some of our health programs, some of our senior benefits. These are baked-in increases every year automatically. If you want to control that, then you have to revisit them. That's what I said. If you don't want to control them, and you don't want to revisit them, then you have to bake in additional revenue of $100 million a year. That's what I'm saying. So, because at the current rate, the way the formula programs work, you're looking at somewhere of about $100 million a year increase in spend. So if we don't add anything else above what's already baked into government now, in 10 years, we'll be spending an extra $1 billion. If we want to do that, if we value those programs, that's a decision that has to be made. But you got to figure out a way to pay for it.
Find the money.
And that's what's missing right now, I think, coming from the legislature. Now, to be fair, there are legislative measures, for example, on a fuel tax. There is a legislative measure on oil taxes, to be fair. But larger discussions on statewide sales taxes, income taxes, et cetera, I don't see that happening. And if that's not going to happen, and quite frankly, I'm a tax last guy, not a tax first guy, let's get the restraints in place. Let's get these advisory votes and constitutional amendments out to the people of Alaska. Because, Lori, there is a chance that the people of Alaska might say, we don't want to restrain our spending. We don't mind the government taking our dividend. They may say that to us. And if they do, then we have carte blanche to design the budget going forward with revenues already identified.
Governor, let's hear from another citizen. This is a gentleman named Ryan.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say, and I know it's a little bit controversial, but the state really needs an income tax. I believe we're one of the only, if not the only state without one, and I feel like maybe the public is a little spoiled. It's a little used to not having to pay that tax. Besides that, I'm not opposed to making cuts or to really critically looking at state services and projects to try to see what's actually worth it and what's not. But just these wide sweeping measures, largely influenced by outside conservative political groups, it just doesn't belong in the state.
So what would you say to Ryan about his statement on both needing an income tax? There are 7 states that don't have a statewide income tax. What would you say to him about that, but also his belief that you're being influenced by outside political groups? This isn't the first time you've heard that.
No. I think, I mean, again, I appreciate the fact that we have Alaskans that are engaged in this. I really do. That's how we're going to get through this. But outside groups have not influenced me in conjuring up a budget deficit. It exists. There's no outside. That's mathematics. This is a mathematical issue. And I know that some folks want to default to, well, this is why he did what he did because he's being influenced by outside groups. That's not the case at all. When I was a teacher in the 1980s, and we went through budget reductions in the 80s when oil dropped dramatically, it was a numbers discussion back then. When I was a senator years ago, it was a numbers discussion back then. It's not outside groups. We have a mathematical structural deficit issue right now. We are spending 1.5 to 1.6 billion more than we are taking in. That's the issue we have to deal with. With regard to the income taxes, was his name Ryan?
Yes.
I would say to Ryan, how much? At what rate? Who's exempt? What's exempt? The devils are in the details. That's why I think there should be a discussion to look at the devils in the details. Because what's going to happen, what happens in most states is once you think that an income tax, just putting an income tax in the book solves it, you have to have a rate. You have to have how much you're going to bring in.
Of course.
How much is it going to increase every year? Who's exempt, et cetera.
And The last year, this notion that you heard from Ryan and others about outside influence, do you think that it was a mistake having Americans for Prosperity run the town hall gatherings last night? That it became a distraction focused more on this idea of outside influence rather than the issues that you were hoping to address?
Certainly, I can see where people will point to that particular group. They don't point to the Chamber of Commerce's that we spoke at or the Rotaries that we spoke at. The way we spoke in a whole host of different venues put on by different groups. But I can understand why folks are saying what they're saying. But that's not the case. Take Mike Dunleavy out of the equation for a moment as governor. Put somebody back in as governor. You still have a $1.6 billion deficit.
All right, thank you, Governor. There's no single answer for resolving the state's fiscal gap. It will take a lot of careful work, compromise, and multiple solutions to stabilize state spending into the future. Alaskans are exceptional at helping each other in a crisis, and setting aside political differences and heated rhetoric is crucial for finding a sensible path to maintain a quality of life that includes great educational opportunities, good-paying jobs, and a healthy population of residents to take advantage of them. It can be done, and the sooner we come together to solve our collective financial problems, the quicker our economy will benefit. That's it for this edition of Alaska Insight. You can find past episodes of the show and related content at our website, alaskapublic.org/Alaska Insight. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Lori Townsend. Good night.